professor. I would like to thank Professor Johan Dura for the invitation. I'm very honored and proud to be here. Thanks for all the participants. The discussions were very interesting, very profound. So thank you, everybody. So my communication is entitled Towards Post-Islam, a Philosophical and Mystical Sketch. I will begin by enunciating my plan. So it will be in 7 parts. An introduction of the general matrix in which post-Islam will be defined. Then I will define post-Islam from a general perspective with its relationship to specific dialectic between excess and concordaism. By post-Islam in general, I mean post-Islam from a philosophical, scientific, theological, mystical point of view. And in the 5th part, I will talk about post-Islam in particular, that is post-Islam from a religious point of view. My 3rd part will be an archetypal philosophical instantiation of post-Islam, and I will study the case of Avicenna's metaphysics. Then I will talk about some hermeneutical problems, and as we will see together, the hermeneutics are the central issue here. It's with hermeneutical problems that we can be able to define post-Islam. Finally, I will discuss very briefly some directive idea of post-Islam. I will enunciate 2 aphorisms in a Nietzschean style on post-Islam, 2 long aphorisms, but I will make it briefly. And finally, I will expose some critical horizons for this work. So I'll begin with my introduction. In this presentation, I will attempt to lay the ground for a tentative definition, or should I say an assemblage of guiding ideas towards what I designate as post-Islam. The endeavor will consist of a first overview of the constellation of some central problematics structuring an emergent system that is post-Islam, remaining in potency in the sense of Aristotle, in multiple forms and of enunciations and semantic variations throughout the history of theology as well as the history of philosophy and science. The main target of this work does not coincide with the closure of a theological philosophical system, namely post-Islam, the consistency of which is in fine established. It is, however, an enterprise of naming or repairing a mystical unthinked, and I underline, an unthinked within the Islamic tradition, which is able to be generalized formally and objectively in a special case of theology. This means that we are constructing a concept of post-Islam from an ontological point of view, relatively to the fundamental question, what is X? More precisely, the unthinked in question takes more the form of a retreat, historically speaking, in front of its own systemization or implementation as a philosophical concept, in a satisfying manner than an absolute blind spot never formulated as such in Islamic mystical history. It might have been localized as a name in the mystical genre of literature, but it remains a philosophically vacant syntagm, an object without a concept. And there is many examples of objects without concepts in the history of Islam. For example, I would say that naming it's not contradictory with the fact that such an orientation is existing in potency without name or concept. For instance, as Ignaz Goldziher discusses it, the lack of nomination of the notion of conscience in Quran is not, according to him, equivalent to a lack of meaning. As he argues, quote, a lack in language does not imply necessarily a lack in the heart. Another example, the same situation is apparent at the dawn of Sufism, that is the Islamic mystical tradition. It was practiced without a concept or a name of it until the 8th century. It is the question of a system bearing unnamed within it its own negation or rule that is apparently fundamental from a logical point of view. This remains a crucial problem in axiomatic theories or formal systems. Mathematically speaking, Gödel's incompleteness theorems show that any sufficiently strong recursively enumerable theory of arithmetic cannot be both complete and consistent. The completeness means the closure of the theory with respect to its inferences. Consistency is the criterion that the theory is coherent, that is, does not imply at once the propositions phi and non-phi. So, if we consider Islam as an axiomatic system, and I will talk about the axioms that define Postislam, according to Gödel's theorem, it is impossible to say that this system cannot bear within it its own rule or its own negation. And as we will see, this negation have a name, and we are trying to name it, in fact. We use the term and think as opposed to experimented. Retroactively, Post-Islam was experimented in an intermittent way. It may be conceived as a singularity, to use Deleuze's terminology, une expérience limite, or a limit experience. Isomorphic, for instance, to the poetical oeuvre of Antonin Artaud, a famous French poet, that is a lamped case of crowned anarchy. Post-Islam is, in fact, a crowned anarchy. Antonin Artaud calls it anarchie couronnée. To spin the metaphor, and by the same means to engage it literally, the usage of this unthink is no more, no less than a suspension of the law regime or Sharia, to render mystically practicable what remains from such a subversion, an anarchic residue ontologically reduced to a transitory state, dedicated to be resolved each time and directly into the prosaic state of affairs governed by Islam's juridical canons. The idea is to give the so-called residue the dignity of the concept, theologically speaking, that is post-Islam. As we will see, this unthinked state remains to a greater or lesser extent inherent to the sphere of Islam. The possibility of its expansion, or genesis into an independent concept, causally induced by Islam, but ontologically separated from it. It is causally induced by Islam, but it is ontologically separated from it. It is the foremost posture of post-Islam. In a word, post-Islam represents a potency without the concept within Islam. It is an unnamed historical gesture disseminated throughout a complex combination of theological and mystical first flattering steps. I will examine some of these instantiations expressed essentially in the Islamic theology and mystical tradition, that is the Sufism in a general acceptance, and the nodal case of Al-Hallaj in particular, which is one of the greatest Sufis ever in the history of Islam. By isolating then the essence of Islam theological mystique, the structural duality between Sharia and Haqiqa, that is the structural duality of Islam. Islam is no more no less than a combination of two poles. Haqiqa or truth, Sharia or law. I can expose it differently by saying that Islam's equation, it's Sharia plus epsilon point Haqiqa, truth. Epsilon in a mathematical sense, that is, Haqiqa is infinitesimal in the Islamic framework with respect to Sharia. Haqiqa is in fact a drop within the ocean of Sharia. So, as we will see, Post-Islam will reverse radically this equation. So we will be able to construct a synthesis identified with the concept of Post-Islam. We out at that step enunciate diverse axioms based on this concept. As a sequel, I will discuss further philosophical counterpoints to this construction. I insist on the fact that this presentation is eminently a philosophical interpretation mobilizing philosophical tools. The claim is, in the last instance, theological. I will not dwell on the philosophy-theology dialectics operating since the dawn of Greek philosophy. What I develop here is at some point a task of philosophy applied to mystique, which would lead to, I hope, a theological sketch, or at least will admit a theological implication. Thus, the rank of speculative thematization will exceed the stricto sensu historical démarche. Another remark of the references of this text. The main philosophical and mystical inspirations are written originally in French. For instance, the monumental study of Louis Massignon, La Passion de Al-Hallaj in 4 tomes. That's it. It's empty because it's so heavy to make a trip with it. So this is the first source of inspiration to construct the concept of post-Islam, and the second inspiration is the New Testament. So if you have these two elements, we can construct post-Islam. So Louis Massignon, in fact, is an Orientalist of the beginning of the 20th century. You can see a photo of him here in Al-Azhar in 1909. We can see here a depiction of the crucifixion of Al-Hallaj. This is why the book is called The Passion of Hallaj, symmetrically to the Passion of Christ. Hallaj was executed in 922. And finally, this is the book, La Passion de Hussein ibn Mansur al-Hallaj, which is translated in English by Herbert Mason. So, all the translation from French and Arabic are mine. Thus, unless otherwise specified, all translations are mine. So, I will pass to the definition of post-Islam. In general, in its more general acceptance, a post-Islam tendency is a regime of thought, philosophical, scientific, mystical, religious, theological, etc., which affirms an excess with respect to at least one of the 3 sources of Islam's juridical canons. The 3 sources of juridical canons in Islam are Quran, Sunnah, that is the authentic compilation of words and acts of Muhammad, and Ijma', that is the consensus of scholars. The excess in question simply reflects a tendency that, even though being grounded in the Islamic text as objectifying them, oriented intentionally toward them in the first instance, does not incorporate a priori a hermeneutical souci or concern of coincidence or concordance with the canons listed above. That is the general definition that I propose for post-Islam. So, the post-Islam essentially exposed here is a theological excess. Thus, it represents a special case of excess, a genre of tendency, post-Islam in particular. And at this point, the hermeneutical problems emerge. One might argue that a post-Islamic excess might be recomposed as such within the Islamic matrix by means of a precise hermeneutics. In fact, there is a fundamental duality in the Islamic exegesis, that is the duality of tafsir and ta'wil. We can translate that by explanation and interpretation. So this duality is primary in the Islamic tradition, while the tafsir is, or explanation, is a formal explanation of terms. The ta'wil is a semantical resorption of apparent logical contradictions. In the Quran, etymologically speaking, ta'wil might be seen as the equivalent to the final cause in the sense of Aristotle of a movement. So, from an Islamic point of view, one might argue that this excess represented by post-Islam might be recomposed within some kind of precise exegesis. That's what Professor told us this morning when he talked about ijtihad. That is an enlightened exegesis. But as you will see, I not agree with him because we don't share the same paradigm. So, thereby, its irreductibility, the post-Islam irreductibility, would be apparently compromised. However, the self-awareness of post-Islamic thought would be consciously or unconsciously conceived in the foremost original intimacy, not conducted theologically, I mean from telos, the final cause, by a concern of concordance in relation to Islamic law, Sharia, or faith, Aqiqa, regardless of the interpretive posture, as heterodox as it can be, adopted retroactively in order to reduce it to an occurrence of Islam's horizons of possibilities. The Islamic concordism is a radical reductionism. When a problem, political, scientific, social, economic, etc., emerges with a fundamental novelty, its resolution from the philosophical point of view that we are applying is invariable within the Islamic framework. Since the ontological closure of Islam is Islamically ensured, because this religion marks supposedly the end of the revelated law and faith forever and ever, the problem in question can be recomposed and annihilated by the means of Islamic dogma. A concordant interpretation will reduce any category of problematicity through a chain of inferences rooted in the axioms of the three canons to a resolution negatively or positively inherent to the law. Let us briefly study a concrete case. The Quran, chapter 4, stipulates that the brothers inherit the double share of their sisters from the property of a departed parent. Let us consider that the problem of some legislative reforms inducing a perfect equality emerges, like it was the case last summer in Tunisia, for instance. The misery, and I underline this term, the misery of concordism takes here its full scale. In fact, the conflict of interpretations between the literalist conservative, faithful to the letter of the Quranic law, and the progressive reformists, struggling for equal rights between women and women, is stricto sensu epiphenomenal. In fine, both of them tend to construct a hermeneutical concordant system of arguments for or against the equality. While the first group considered this as a profound subversion of the sacred revelation, the second group argues that equality is not contradictory with the law under a certain exegesis. Both of them seems to be so far from each other, but in fact, they are so close insofar as they actualize the same structural position, a deep step in concordism. They share the same plane of reference to the canons. Both of them are evolving within the same Islamic matrix. What is post-Islam then? Post-Islam is a radical abolition of this ground, since it is indifferent to the sterile or scholastic, in the negative term, of interpretations, since it is a force oriented to the elsewhere. What it suggests remains a vital paradigm shift from the invariant background of the becoming same, progressive, or the same resting reactionary of the law. Post-Islam presents an alternative conatus in the sense of Spinoza. What is the conatus of post-Islam? It is striving to preserve in its detachment from the concordist, striving to persist under the realm of law. We will discuss further hermeneutical problem in the 4th paragraph. Since the main cheval de bataille of Islam's reformists, let us say, from the end of the 19th century, is eminently hermeneutical, that is centered on the false problem: what modern interpretation could or would Islam support with respect to its essence? A post-Islamic refonte, or remodeling or recasting, is fundamentally indifferent to interpretational dilemmas, insofar as its final cause, in any way whatsoever, is concordist. Conversely, one might consider a thought experiment, very strange thought experiment, in which a system demonstrates, according to immanent Quranic interpretation, that in fact Islam represents a latent atheism. Let us imagine this strange experience. Roughly speaking, since this position assumes a singular or paradoxical concordism, it will not be considered as post-Islamic. In the end, if the motion of thought is caused by a final canonic cause, Quran or Sunnah or Ijma', and even though if this same motion will seem as incommensurable with the tradition, it would be rejected from the post-Islam's realm. We can call it sur-Islamic, hyper-Islamic, or anti-Islamic, but under no circumstances post-Islamic. The latter is an excess beyond the concordism and anti-concordism dialectics. Another example, a theological proposition, for example, the creation or the eternity of Quran, a faith act in the Judgment Day, or in a special paradigm of paradisiac delights, a social phenomenon, inheritance, is Islamic if it is the result of a recomposition throughout a hermeneutical precise procedure. It is non-Islamic if it is not in it. It is in if it concords, and out if it does not. So, mathematically speaking, the main operator of Islamic concordism are set theoretical. I don't know if you know the set theory in mathematics. That is the theory that is centered on the problems of belongings. X belongs to Y, etc. So the main operator of Islamic concordism are set theoretical. Belong doesn't belong, namely the in and out operator. Is it in or is it out? But for post-Islam, the main operator is derivative or differential, a certain dy dx, namely the by operator. While the Islam is concerned with the in-out, the post-Islam is concerned with the by operator. functioning, mathematically speaking, as a tangent to what would be the Islam's curves. So it is a tangent that goes infinitely, that touches Islam but goes infinitely away. So, to resume all of this, post-Islam versus Islam hermeneutically is very simple. While Islam is concordist, post-Islamic is excessive and indifferent to concordism. Post-Islam versus Islam geometrically can be represented by this. That is, if the Islam is this sphere, this manifold, post-Islam would be a tangent plane that touches Islam at some points, but in fine, it goes away. So this is the three verses that I would like to talk to you about. Let's take another concrete example, that is the special case of Avicenna's metaphysics. Before thematizing the post-Islamic framework in the particular sense of referring to mystical excess, let us focus on the general case of the philosophical one. Thus, I will try to briefly explore an archetypal posture what could be considered as philosophically post-Islamic. It is indeed the case of Avicenna's metaphysics. Avicenna, chief and prince of philosophers, according to Roger Bacon, is probably the most important philosopher in the history of Islamic thought. Eminent commentator of Aristotle, his book of Al-Shifa, The Cure, is a decisive masterpiece of medieval thought. Indeed, the Middle Ages would not be the same without Avicenna. One could be easily convinced of such a statement by reviewing the rays of Avicenna's influence through the eras. So, this is the rays of Avicenna's influence. There, you can see Thomas Aquinas, you can see Duns Scotus, you can see Maimonides, you can see a lot of philosophers, medieval philosophers, influenced by Avicenna. I will not present an expose of Avicenna's system. In fact, the literature is abundant on this question. However, what I will briefly highlight is the post-Islamic scope of Avicenna's metaphysics, its irreducible excess. So, Avicenna's metaphysics represents, in fact, a fundamental invariant logged in the history of philosophy from Parmenides to Heidegger. He elaborates earlier than Anselm of Canterbury a proof of the existence of God, known as the proof of the truthful, Burhan al-Siddiqin, based exclusively on the notions of existence, necessity, and possibility. The totality of being proceeds according to a theory of emanation from the first principle, neither intentionally nor purposely, but as a necessity of its being qua being. I will skip some of these slides to pass to the central question. My central question, hermeneutically, is this one. With respect to what type of hermeneutic can we determine if a proposition or a system of proposition within the Islamic framework have the potential to be seen as post-Islamic? The first answer could be formulated as following. Concerning Avicenna's case, Avicenna's system is has exclusive philosophical finalities. The essential concern of the theory of emanation and of Avicenna thought in general is in excess with respect to canonic texts, insofar as it means and purposes are purely philosophical, even though it may enter in conflict with the revealed law. The conception fluxes towards some kind of philosophical consistency, obtained by logical inferences. As Adamson stresses, commenting the Avicennian proof of uniqueness of God, quote, Avicenna signals the relation between his project and Islamic conception of God, but philosophical considerations also make it pressing to show that there is only the necessary existent. Thus, the Avicennian theses are enounced regardless of their Islamic affinity. They are conducted causally and not ontologically by the revelation. Moreover, radical excess is expressed within the theory of emanation in the sense that the proceeding of intellects and celestial spheres from the first principle has existed extensively neither echo in Quran and Sunnah. It is a metaphysical parallel, an independent model, purely Hellenistic, purely Greek, that might be downstream read as conform to Islamic referential. Okay, so what is the difference between this excess and the Islamic concordism? So conversely, the major themes of mutakallimun or Islamic theologians joined to their methods and above all their purposes are essentially concordance. For instance, Al-Mu'tazila, a branch of mutakallimun or Islamic theologians, corroborate their thesis of the creation of the Quran by Quranic means. They corroborate the thing by the thing itself. It's a circular argument, in fact. That is the misery of concordism. This posture is diametrically opposed to Avicenna's program. The former purpose is to conceal theology and revealed law in the last instance by revelation's means, while the latter Avicenna starts and finishes his proof inside the theological philosophical framework, regardless of the concordance with the canonical texts. Thus, the former represents the Islamic thought. That's the Islamic thought. That's the concordism of the Mu'tazila. We have a theology isomorphic to revelation and the synthesis that is absolutely concordist. Thus, the former represents the Islamic thought in its purest form without any excess, while the latter, as it is indifferent to concordist issues, must be considered as post-Islamic, which the excess that it engaged always tangential to Islam. So, it is always tangential. It's never in or out. It's always the by operator. So, I think that I will skip the second part of the hermeneutical problems that engages some of Paul Ricoeur's ideas. I will pass directly to the directive ideas of post-Islam in particular. Let us recall the general characterization of post-Islamic tendency. It is a tendency that, even though being grounded in the Islamic texts as objectifying them, does not incorporate a priori a hermeneutical purpose of concordance with the revelation. This definition is applicable in philosophical, scientific, and theological fields as I illustrated it for Avicenna's metaphysics. What would be post-Islam in particular? Frugally, it will be the result of applying the main characterization to mystical theology. It will be a mystical excess. In its more general acceptance, mystical theology is the foundational theory of the dialectics between the Supreme Being, Allah, the Trinity, etc., and ascetic reflexive practices. In Islam, the mystical tendency is dominated by the history of Sufism. I will not dwell on the complex development of this practice. In fact, the literature is abundant on this question. You can see the Epistle on Sufism by Abu al-Qasim al-Qushayri. It is an excellent synthesis of all the problematics of Sufism. I will directly develop a crucial theological discovery of Sufism, that is the structural duality of Islam. Roughly speaking, the essence of Islamic thought and theology is the synthesis of two opposite notions. Haqiqa, I will zap all of these. So it's a combination of the concept of Haqiqa, that is truth or reality, and Sharia law. So what is Haqiqa in fact? Here is a definition. The concept of Haqiqa, and I cite Mark Swallow, this concept of Haqiqa has also been taken up by Sufis, for whom Haqiqa is so important that it can be considered the ultimate purpose of the mystic path, which is attainment of true knowledge through experience of the divine mysteries. It usually refers to hidden as opposed to manifest meaning, and is often used in contrast with Sharia, the formal outward practices and laws of Islam. While Sufis often focus on the inner meaning, haqiqa, of a practice, most agree that the former practice should not, however, be neglected. Sharia and haqiqa have in fact been compared to the body and the spirit of religion, and are said to operate together as two sides of the same coin, etc. End of the quote. So, what is Sharia versus Haqiqa? How can we summarize it? We can summarize it with this table. Haqiqa is esoteric and Sharia is exoteric. Haqiqa is the core while Sharia is the surface, etc. Haqiqa is infinite, Sharia is finite. Haqiqa is correlated to prophethood. Sorry, I inverted. Haqiqa is correlated to holiness or walaya, and Sharia is correlated to prophethood. Haqiqa is anarchic, chaotic, and Sharia is structured. Schematically, Islam is no more, no less than a fragile equilibrium inherited from Jewish law and Christian grace, holy grace. Thus, its inner essence has been crystallized by this Sufi duality. Islam is in fine the area of interference between these two opposite sides and stands in virtue of their coexistence. So, there is two sides of this affair. There is Islam. It is in French, but I'll translate very briefly. Islam. There is two kinds of Muslims. There is what I call the lambda Muslim, or the Muslim lambda. For the lambda Muslim, the law, la loi, implies the truth or the haqiqa. Always in the Islamic framework, we can find the lambda Sufi. Who is the lambda Sufi? For the lambda Sufi, the law is equivalent to the truth. That means that the law implies the truth and the truth implies the law. But we have some kind of quantum tunneling between Islam and post-Islam, a very mysterious tunnel, a very mysterious frontier. From a post-Islamic point of view, and from the point of view of the Alpha Sufi, what I call the Alpha Sufi, there is no Sharia, there is no law at all. We can say that, as written in French, vérité equals vérité. Truth equals truth. Full stop. There is nothing else to say. And the archetypal figure of the Alpha Sufi is in fact Hussein ibn Mansur Al-Hallaj. It is Mansur Al-Hallaj, who died in 922, that was the first to break the structural duality of Islam, opening it to the horizon of excess, of Haqiqa, open Sharia, of theopathy, open theology. In one word, the transcendence of the ecstatic intuition of the transcendent in relation to the conceptual law. By his locution, I am the truth. He said, I am the truth, or I am the real, or I am God, and Al-Haq in Arabic. Through his extraordinary, innovative Kitab al-Tawasin, the Book of Tawasin, and in the end, by his tragical martyrdom, Hallaj was the condition of possibility, in a Kantian sense, of a coincidence between the Islamic heritage and transcendent ecstatic experience. Since this conversion does not remain inherent to Islam, in the sense that it resolves it in pure Haqiqa, we've seen that Islam cannot exist without the coexistence of Haqiqa and Sharia. If we resolve Sharia in Haqiqa, we obtain Postislam. If we resolve the law in the grace, we obtain Postislam. So the equation that I've showed you will be inversed. So, which lead us to the radical subtraction of Sharia. Post-Islam is the name of such a resultant. Thus, Hallaj is the first post-Muslim in the particular meaning of mystical theology. I have a passage of Louis Massignon describing the eminent contribution of Hallaj in structuring this revolution that is the excess of Haqiqa open Sharia, but I don't have the time to read it for you. So I think that I will pass to my aphorism on Post-Islam. I'll just make two aphorisms so I can connect Islam to the Christian notion of grace. So the first aphorism. What does it mean to be a Muslim? If we were necessary to condense the formula, one could argue that symmetrically to the syntagm, to have faith, in French, avoir la foi, one would have to invent to have the law, avoir la loi, no more, no less. Muslim have the law, where the only possible faith in Islam would solely be a legal prescription, as a corollary, and contrary to a famous passage from the Epistle to the Romans, grace, or charis in Greek, ceases to be surabundant, given Sharia replacement, exhaustively prescriptive, and coercive. Strikingly, a purely restorative counter-revolution. St. Paul never took place, one would say. The massive psychoanalysis of the Muslim subject, sizing the terrorist horror, missed the essence of his or her mundane manifestation, a disintegration of the Muslim desire in a broad sense. For every theory of the subject engaged a theory of desire, and every theory of desire is articulated dialectically or anti-dialectically, with respect to the law. In this case, the law with a capital L, that is Sharia. However, the alienation of the Muslim desire is hardly a phenomenal contingency. To be strictly under the yoke of the law, fully under the law, only under the law, it is so for Islam. The Muslim evade the reign of grace, itself supposed to be subtractive because eventual, at least in the Paulinian sense, and generates at the same time the ruin of his or her desire. Blunted, so it would be the universalizable singularity of the resurrection of Christ, and restoring a strong form of so-called universal communitarianism, That Muslims have the law simply implied that the noting of the common is no longer the race, but the void repetition of the law vis-à-vis its subjects. Here is very briefly the post-Islamic diagnosis. The deconstruction of Islam is nothing other than a reflection on the possibility of grace, or a prototype of grace, patent in the Islamic tradition as an epsilon state. Post-Islam tends to expand this epsilon state to a legitimate and sedimented theory and praxis. In addition, it is exactly the Hallajian point of no return, which is the systemization of the deduction emanating from the concept of Haqiqa, which inscribed the solution. Grace in Islam is the Haqiqa. A final aphorism, in the end, what is the essence of post-Islam? A rewriting of grace from the standpoint of Haqiqa and vice versa. In fact, the time of the gospel is an intermittent suspension of the reign of the law. Symmetrically, theopathy acting in the heart of the world springing ineluctably from the Haqiqa. Recall that the Haqiqa, the truth, is classically described, according to Saint Thomas Aquinas, for instance, as an adequatio rei et intellectus. That is, in the Sufi context, the fulgurant divine presence over its dead impresence that the letter of the law presents. This is an adequacy between the enunciated locution of sub-ecstasy and the empirical reality of the divine mysteries revealed in communion or illumination, not meditated by the law. Because when Hallaj pronounces his creed, Al-Hallaj, I am the truth, he announces the event, the occurrence of such a fragile adequatio rei et intellectus, once registered in potency and presentially and immediately effective in act. Grace or charis suspends the law by completing it in the gift. The Haqiqa updates the epoche in the Husserlian sense of the law, by opening it into the horizon of its closing, always revived by a resurgence of the law, and whose sense takes shape only by a form of eclectism or election that is reminiscent of the free gift of grace. The Son of Man becomes Son of God in Christian grace, and the servant becomes Master or God in the Islamic Haqiqa, as proclaimed by Ibn Arabi in the Bezel of Wisdom. So Ibn Arabi, I read just the first verse. At one time, the servant is a Lord without a doubt, and at another, he is really a servant without a lie. In either case, it is the erratic abrogation and abolition of the law that initiates the possibility of grace or Haqiqa. Thus, that Jesus could have hiketnun, purified the paralytic of his sins in a famous passage from the Gospel according to Mark, this was considered a heresy by the contents of the law, the scribes. Whereas it was ultimately the illumination of grace eternally overhanging the regime of the law and opening a paradigm shift, an epistemological break according to Bachelard or Althusser, or should we say a theopathic break. So here is the passage from the Gospel of Mark. In the end, Jesus said, which is easier to say to this paralyzed man, your sins are forgiven, or to say, get up, take your mat and walk? But I want you to know that the Son of Man had authority on earth to forgive sins. So he said to the man, I tell you, get up, take your mat and go home. In this sense, also in the Epistle of the Romans, Saint Paul subsumes the regime of the law to that of universal grace. So, briefly, in the Epistle of the Romans, Saint Paul says, or is God the God of Jews only? Is he not the God of Gentiles too? Yes, of Gentiles too. Since there is only one God who will justify the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through that same faith. The same structure is manifest in the Haqiqa insofar as contrary to the law, which is indefinitely attested in the Shahada within the Islamic creed, faith is lived in the intimacy of the burning presence, and that no logos can account for it, except perhaps in the form of traces that crystallize on the lips of the Sufi Alpha, the presence of God coupled with his legal absence. Mysticism is none other than the theory of the practice of the illegal presence of God. The universal monotheism and monism of Al-Hallaj and St. Paul echo this idea that the regional aspect of the law lack the archetype of an absolute democratization of the divine presence, which can potentially be experienced without meditation, rites, or submission. This is how, so I have a quote from Alain Badiou, but I think that I have no time to, I can conclude. So my conclusion would be very brief. So the critical horizons, what is the main problems if you consider this concept of post-Islam? Considering that the equation post-Islam equals Islam minus the law equals Haqiqa, equals truth. The most difficult task consists in the elaboration of a theory of praxis of Haqiqa, unleashed from the law's injunctions, even though, practically speaking, they persist at funding the framework of faith. If post-Islam is an integral mystique based on the possibility of a permanent theophany, and definitely experienced throughout ecstatic theopathy, it might appear likely strong to assume such a possibility without the establishment of a concrete modus operandi leading to theophany, especially in the case of mystical experience, which is, by definition, fuzzy and ineffable. Briefly, the possibility of post-Islam as a theory is conditioned by a rigorous formulation of an epistemology of revelation and incarnation. Furthermore, the deconstruction of Islam's structural duality promoted by the post-Islamic project might reboot formally and objectively anti-immanent themes, the form of transcendence of the Sufi theopathy, the dialectical definition of the problem, etc. This foe could be overcome by non-philosophical tools developed by François Laruelle. The core of post-Islam, that is the integral mystique, would have to formally define its machinery, isolating non-dialectically the Haqiqa and ontologically to dualize correctly its theology of the one, according to Laruelle, the dual as it differentiates itself from the double. Is the fundamental matrix of non-philosophy that defines a general order founded upon the being foreclosed of the one, source of irreversibility or unilaterality between the experience of the immanence of the one and the object which is foreclosed, the world, whereas the dual is still not unilateral duality, which sets cloning in play. It is opposed par excellence to philosophy's form as mixture founded upon reversibility and reciprocity. End of quote. Post-Islam must be an immanent theory of the possibility of non-dialectical and thus subtracted to Sharia access to the one. Thank you.
Thank you to our presenter, Mohamed bin Mustapha. This was quite a substantial philosophical treatment of not such a light topic that you introduced to us. I believe to many of us a lot of what you said was new and was relatively complex terminologically and also in terms of contents. So thank you for this rich presentation. I believe it is rather thought-provoking especially for the Islamic scholars here, but of course for all of us. So I open the floor now to questions and comments, please. Yes, please.
Yes. Thank you for your presentation, although it was, as Professor Mikhail said, that it's very complex presentation, and the majority of terms are, some of the terms are new for all of us. So I'd like to ask a small question regarding Islamic jurisprudence. I will pass post-Islam and so on, but I would like to ask about Sharia and truth. You know, according to Islamic jurisprudence, Sharia and Haqiqa are the same. I mean, there is no.
Can you repeat this? I don't hear you.
So regarding to, I will pass. I told you I'll pass post-Islam and
yes,
such terms. So I would like to ask about truth and
yes,
law.
Truth and law.
Okay. So in Islamic jurisprudence, we say that there is no difference between Haqiqa and Sharia, because in some, Quranic passages or Quranic texts, if Professor Abdul Rashid agrees with me, that the Quran say that what we are telling you is the truth itself. So this is Sharia according to the understanding of Islamic scholars. So my question is, why you make a difference or a separation or a partition between truth and Sharia? This is the first question. The second question related to Al-Hallaj. Truth according to Al-Hallaj is something superior than religion, because in some of his quotes when he said that there is nothing inside this garment except God, except Allah, this means that, and sometimes he says there's no God but me, or in its Arabic classical term say La ilaha illa ana subhani ma a'zama sha'ni. So this is regarding the truth according to the concept of halal. Also, interpretation and hermeneutics. Why you made a comparison between the hermeneutic in Quranic text and the final case according to the Aristotelian tradition? Okay? It's enough, or I continue? It is allowed.
Yes, I think let's pause here. Let him maybe give you some feedback, and then if you want to continue,
okay.
build on that. Is that okay?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Maybe.
So, from the Islamic point of view, you say that there is an equivalence between Sharia and Haqiqa.
Yes, from the Quranic text.
Okay, but the Haqiqa that I am theorizing here is the Haqiqa in the sense of Hallaj. That is something that is kind of over-religious. That's why the post-Islam, the first characterization of post-Islam is that is an excess. It's a figure of excess. You know what I mean? So,
no, but you mentioned in the beginning that the duality of Islam is Haqiqa and Sharia. So
that is what how Sufis define Islam. But what I'm talking about is no more Islam. I insist on this point. It is no more Islam because we break this duality. Post-Islam is exactly the inversion of this equation, that if Islam's equation is Sharia plus epsilon of Haqiqa, that is infinitesimal part of Haqiqa, the post-Islam would be totally the inverse, that is epsilon Sharia plus Haqiqa, or more radically, a pure Haqiqa. So a pure identification to the celestial God. We have to give this ecstatic state of Hallaj. It is ecstatic. That is not something that is prosaic.
But
that we can.
I'm sorry, Islam's equation. This is according to Al-Hallaj or according to Islam?
No, that's the Islam as defined by Sufis and by scholars. Islam is a part of Sharia that is fundamental, and an epsilon, a drop of Haqiqa. But as I discussed it here, there is two kinds of Muslims. There is the Muslims who think that the law with the capital L implies the truth,
Yes.
And that's the Muslim, that's the Lambda Muslim, the everyday Muslim. And there is the Lambda Sufi that considers that the law and the truth are equivalent. But the Post-Islam is another affair. There is no place for the law in the Islam, in the post-Islamic framework. It is a pure ecstatic state, and the problem, the central problem, because it is eventual, this ecstatic state. When Saint Teresa of Avila make an ecstatic experience, it cannot be reproduced every day, because it is an event of faith. The problem is, how can we democratize this event of faith, this ecstatic state, forever and ever? That is the central question of post-Islam.
But Teresa of Avila, it's personal mystical experience that can't be generalized or can be put in comparison with the Islamic Sufi. It's according to my understanding to your point.
Can you repeat?
Teresa of Avila, I mean.
Yes.
It's personal mystical experience.
Yes.
Okay. That can be applied to Islamic jurisprudence or Islamic Sufi.
Cannot be applied.
Like, yeah.
It is the same structure what Al-Hallaj or Ibn Arabi in the Illuminations of Mecca, or Aba Yazid al-Bastami, or others that were other Sufis that were experiencing what is called shath. You know shath?
Yeah.
The shath, that is the ecstatic locutions.
But
like
the same, yeah. I mean, it's cool. Shath. We can't say that Al-Hallaj, Ibn Arabi, Aba Yazid al-Bastami, the same school of shath.
Yes,
yeah.
but the structure is the same.
Yeah.
That's the overwhelming presence of God is the source of shath. But this state cannot be generalized easily. If we can give to this state the dignity of concept, if we can't think of it not as an intermittent state, but as a stable state, not as an event, but as an event that can be repeated, in that way we can construct post-Islam.
Even if they disagree about the start point.
Even if
they disagree about the start point. For example, according to Teresa of Avila, the Holy Spirit is the start point.
I think I understand.
Yes.
It's not a central problem for me. I mean, the structure. I am structuralist on this point. It is the same structure that is repeated.
You mean you propose it in the context of history of ideas?
Of?
History of ideas.
History of ideas, yes.
So the second.
You finished then?
Yes.
No, he answered to the first question.
Right. Continue.
After you.
Tafsir and ta'wil.
Yes.
Explanation and interpretation and hermeneutics.
Interpretation and explanation.
Okay, interpretation and explanation. Why you made a comparison between ta'wil in Quranic text and the final case?
Because the final cause, yes, because the final cause in Aristotle's sense,
yes,
is what is the telos of a thing. That is the objective or the final point into which an object or a discourse moves.
But the telos of Aristotle is not God. But according to the Islamic
yes,
interpretation, it's God.
Yes, but the final, when I mean it is the final cause, that is in the sense that what explanation and interpretation, final cause or objective, is to simply annihilate the apparent contradictions of the text. That is the essence of the exegesis. That is, if there is some formulas or some ideas that are apparently contradictory in the text, the hermeneutics tends to deconstruct these apparent logical contradictions. This is why I name it a final cause, because it is destined to deconstruct or to make these contradictions stop. That's it.
So according to Avicenna and Anselm, you mentioned there is some kind of similarity between Avicenna and Anselm of Canterbury.
I said too simply that the proof of existence of God, the proof, of the truthful, Burhan al-Siddiqin, is anterior to the proof of the existence of God of Anselm of Canterbury.
No, but
That's
Anselm
it.
of Canterbury builds his argument about, when he speaks about ontological argument,
Yes.
you know, the only truth that is God, that's
Yes.
being. But Avicenna, he talks about something else. For example, he said wajib and mumkin, what is possible and
Yes,
what is be.
Yes.
So in the metaphysics of Avicenna, it's twofold. Not only one direction like Anselm of Canterbury. For
No,
example.
I said there is a proof, an ontological proof of the existence of God that is anterior to the proof of Anselm. That is all I say. I'm not discussing the differences between the two proofs. I mean that there is a proof in Avicenna and the proof in the system of
There is
Anselm.
similarity.
It is a proof of. It is an ontological proof of the existence of God. It is a proof of existence of God. That's it. And the proof of Avicenna is anterior to the proof of Anselm, historically speaking. Avicenna is before.
Of course.
That's it.
But Augustine also talked about this.
That's I said there is.
Before Avicenna.
Yes. Okay. Okay.
Okay, are you done with your questions?
Only one,
One more.
the last one, and it's okay. I'm sorry for
No?
my
Okay.
long discussion, but about the
Okay.
theory of emanation according to Avicenna.
Hmm?
Theory of Al-Fayyid.
Yes.
You read to the Islamic context, that's right? Or
I
not?
said that the theory of emanations is, in my sense, purely Greek or Hellenistic.
It's a new Platonic one.
Hmm? It is a new Platonic. If you see the system of the hypostasis
Yes.
in the Enneads of Plotinus,
Yes.
that is the one, the intellect, and the soul, the three hypostases.
After all, the material world.
Yes, but in the Enneads, Plotinus, in the second Ennead, Plotinus explains that there is only three hypostases. Okay? So, the passage from one hypostasis to the other, from one hypostasis to the other, is a kind of emanation. That is the emanation of the one that donates the consistency of the intellect and the higher part of the spirit is intellectual and the lower part of the spirit is material.
Yeah,
Or
it seems
sensitive.
that every hypostasis is derived from the previous one.
Yes, yes.
But according to Avicenna, he doesn't think, in his metaphysics, because if he has said something like this, he would have been accused of heresy. Theory of
But
emanation.
he said something. He said, I can tell you what he has said. For example, in one letter, Avicenna says that, he says, he is heretical, because he says in one of his letters that you enter into the realm of impiety and that you quit the appearance of Islam. You must aim your intellectual gaze beyond the three objects created of vulgar belief, that is paradise, hell, and limbo, and thus stop being Muslim and impious at the same time. So stop pronouncing the two terms negation and affirmation from the Shahada or creed, and renounce telling yourself you are Muslim or ungodly, that is, enter into the pure and one being without specification. That's Plotinus.
Yes.
That's Plotinus, and that's her. It's a heresy.
The greatest heresy.
It's a heresy. But that's what I say. This is the reason why I say that Avicenna's metaphysics, and this letter, I didn't quote it, but Avicenna's metaphysics is absolutely an archetype of post-Islamic thought. You can see that post-Islam is a heresy. It's a heresy because when we say we abolish the law, and if Islam is the structural duality between the law and the truth, if we abolish one part of Islam, then we abolish all Islam. So we are in heresy. Post-Islam is a heresy. I don't hide it. It's like that.
That's great. This is what I wanted to conclude.
Okay, let's move on. Okay,
Thank you.
Professor Abdul, I think, wants to ask a question, please.
Thank you very much for the theological cum mathematical presentation. As you are student of PhD and you are going on research, and my comments will be helpful for you for your further research.
Yes.
You in your presentation you discussed the Sharia and Haqiqa.
Yes.
If we will go to the Sufi perspective,
Yes.
there is another thing, another terminology, that is Sharia, Haqiqa, and Marifa. Okay? Sharia, Haqiqa, and Marifa.
In fact, excuse me, there is four. There is Sharia, there is Tariqa before Marifa, and then there is Marifa, and then there is Haqiqa. So the Tariqa, the path, Tariqa is the path. The path
Means
is leading to Marifa, to knowledge, and knowledge is leading to Haqiqa. So in fact, but in its simplified forms, say Sharia and Haqiqa and all the rest are some kind of schematism in the Kantian sense between concept and senses.
No, as Professor did, Sharia
Haqiqa is approach, huh? It's approach.
Sharia, Sharia, Haqiqa is same. Sharia, Haqiqa is same. Yes.
Yes, that
if you go to the, I am coming, I will give you the references, no problem. And for this, there is a very famous book, Kashf al-Mahjub. The writer of Sayyid Al-Hallaj.
Can you repeat the name of the author?
Kashf al-Mahjub.
The author.
Author Sayyid Ali al-Hallaj. Sayyid Ali Hajwari.
رفع المحجوب. That's it. كشف المحجوب.
Kashf al-Mahjub. The open.
Yeah, open. Yeah.
The unveiling of the veil.
And a translation is available. Actually, this book is in Persian, Arabic, but translation, English translation is available.
In English also.
Also.
Okay.
I can read it in Arabic.
So Arabic is not. So you will go there. We discuss in detail. That this is Sharia and Haqiqa, and this is Marifa and other things. Okay. The other thing is, if you want to know about reconstructionism of Islam, reconstructionism of Islam, there is a very good book by Mohamed Iqbal. These are the lectures he delivered in different places, and he discussed what was post-Islam, what was Islam, and what is the Islam we need now.
He talks about post-Islam like this. ما بعد الإسلام. He says ما بعد الإسلام.
No,
قبل الإسلام.
قبل الإسلام.
قبل الإسلام, Islam and Islam al-an. We need, according to us. And this book is very important for you. Reconstructionism of Islam. Why we need reconstruction? Why? Because of these things.
What is the name of this book? What's the name of this book?
This is in English also.
What is the name?
Iqbal.
I know the author, the Iqbal. تجديد الإسلام.
Iqbal, our
Can I make
poet.
a remark?
Yes, why not?
Iqbal, in fact, is in the filiation of the King Kurdists of the 19th century, like Al-Afghani,
Jamaluddin Afghani.
Jamaluddin Al-Afghani,
Yeah.
like Al-Kawakibi,
Maybe.
Mohamed Iqbal in this filiation. And all of these scholars are focusing on the problem of how can we conserve the essence of Islam and adapt it in a manner or another to the prescription of the modernity. For me, it's a false problem. Because, and it is the most scholastic problem in the negative sense of the term that exists. And if there is a problem within Islamic theology right now, and from Hallaj, let's say, because it is the breaking point myself, if there is a essential problem, it will be Concordianism. That is the way that we want to have some equilibrium between modern stuff and the essence of Islam. This Concordianism is the ruin of Islamic thought. If there is a horizon for Islamic thought, it should be, first of all, discovered within Islam, and within Islam, the archetype of this horizon is the notion of Haqiqa.
Okay. And you will be well remembered when you are quoting Hallaj, you know, so many Muslim philosophers rejected the Hallaj theory.
Of course.
So it's very difficult to say. They rejected Hallaj theory and not rejected rejected by the reference, by the reason. So this is why, in this perspective, if you will come to the reconstruction of it, you will understand it. The other thing is...
can I make a comment?
Yes.
Ibn Taymiyyah, for example, in his Fatawa, Ibn Taymiyyah, he said that we asked him if Hallaj is a Muslim. And he said, no, absolutely not. Hallaj is not a Muslim. And I agree with Ibn Taymiyyah.
So Ibn Taymiyyah and dozen of other, not only...
He is here.
Dozen of
He is here, sorry. He is here, in fact. He is no Muslim anymore.
Who?
Al-Hallaj. According to Ibn Taymiyyah.
According to Ibn Taymiyyah, not for us. Not from us. According to Ibn Taymiyyah. Not only because. This is, I think, not they said he is out of Islam. They rejected his idea. Both are different things.
Yes.
If you reject an idea, it's a different thing. If you said he is out of religion, it's a different thing. They don't, the same other thing, you also discovered that there is two kind of Muslim. I think.
Yes, this figure?
No, generally, not figure. I am not mathematician. What do you mean by this two kind of Muslim?
I mean simply that the Sufi is a more sophisticated degree of Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
Because for the simple Muslim,
Mm-hmm.
the faith is a legal prescription. You have to have you have faith in God because God tells you to have faith on God. It's circular.
Mm-hmm.
You can see that it's circular. So the faith is a legal prescription. That's the Muslim, and I call him the lambda Muslim, so the Muslim of every day. But the Sufi, the lambda Sufi, is someone who says, listen guys, it's more complicated than that. The faith is not legal prescription, but there is an isomorphism, an equivalence between the faith and the law. So the law implies the faith, but the faith implies also the law. So there is an equivalence. So I said there is two kinds. One is more sophisticated than the other.
Okay, the last, I need your attention. Last, you also discussed the tafsir and ta'wil. Okay, tafsir and ta'wil.
Excuse me?
You discussed the tafsir.
Tafsir and ta'wil, yes,
huh?
yes.
And when you go to the ta'wil, قالت الأعراب آمنا قل لم تؤمنوا ولكن قولوا أسلمنا. What's you difference this one?
The difference.
By two Muslim are Mohamed and Muslim.
There is also ta'wil and tafsir.
Tafsir. According to Ta'wil, what is your according to Ta'wil, not tafsir?
Yeah.
There is a hadith that differentiates between the Islam, the Iman, and the Ihsan. The famous hadith of Jibreel. You know.
We know.
So the Islam is the 5 pillars of Shahada, prayer, etc. The Iman is the faith, the Aqiqa, that we believe in God, we believe in the judgment day, etc. And the Ihsan, how can we translate that? Is to worship God as you can see Him. أن تعبد الله كأنك تراه فإن لم تكن تراه فإنه يراك.
With great dedication. It means with great dedication.
So
okay.
Ihsan, it's kind of Haqiqa, in fact.
No, Professor Rashid, he means ta'wil regarding Arab and Islam. Arab and Islam. That's what he asked about ta'wil and tafsir.
Arab and Islam?
Yeah. قالت الأعراب آمنا.
Yes.
Yeah.
قل لم تؤمنوا ولكن قولوا أسلمنا.
ولكن قولوا أسلمنا.
Because
هو يسألك عن هذا عن التفسير والتأويل في هذا
for this I can respond you by saying that Iman is a more sophisticated degree of Islam, and the Hadith said it. So we can be Muslim,
but we can't be mu'min.
But we can't be a perfect Muslim.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, this is what
Thank you.
But there is 3 stages in the Hadith.
Yeah.
Islam, then Iman, then Ihsan. So the Iman is more sophisticated than Islam.
Okay, we're getting into some very technical details of the Muslim faith, I see. Thank you for this wonderful discussion. Some of it I could understand and follow. Some perhaps not, but that's my problem, my lack of knowledge. But I do have a question, perhaps to summarize it and maybe to sum it up a little bit for us, non-specialists in this. And the question is, Professor Suleiman, he asked you several questions, and then finally you said, well, but post-Islam is of course a heresy, and Avicenna would, as a precursor to post-Islam or prototype, archetype,
Yeah.
he would also be, based on his letter and maybe on his metaphysics, he would be a heretic in the eyes of general Islam or whatever you would like to call it. So it is not quite clear to me when you described this post-Islam to us, this intellectual movement or this challenge, right? Did you describe it as something, as a phenomenon that's taking place and it's interesting to know about this danger for Islam, or did you describe it as the way that you actually want the Islamic world to follow because you see the future of Islam in post-Islam?
Absolutely. It's
the second
case.
The second
it's
case.
Not a danger.
Okay. So you would see the future of Islam in a post-Islamic paradigm, really.
Absolutely. And the problem that for the concordists, we have the concordist and the anti-concordist. So, for example, you can find in Tunisia person that say we must deconstruct Islam, so we must apply Marxism.
Oh, yes.
Or we can apply some Nietzschean ungodly and absolutely anti-religious lecture or reading.
Yes.
But I think that this posture is also insignificant, because if you want to deconstruct a system, you must avoid externalism. That is, you make Marx, you take Marx against Islam or Nietzsche against the Islam. We must avoid externalism. Our approach must be internalist. That's why I mobilize Avicenna, Al-Hallaj, etc. But in the same time, it shouldn't be concordist. Though there is two ways that we must avoid. The externalist deconstruction, it is totally absurd. When you say Marx against the Islam.
No.
Okay.
I agree, yes.
And
But using Avicenna, isn't that externalist also? I mean, historically he happens to be a Muslim, but his way of thinking was Neoplatonic. So in a way, it's also externalist. Using him and his ideas, it's a case of externalism too.
because that is the problem, because historically he's a Muslim, and he writes within the Islamic tradition. He's considered as a Muslim philosopher.
Right.
But
So
how can we define the
Yeah.
problem? The question will be, how could we define Islamic philosophy? Islamic philosophy cannot be separated from its Hellenistic resources.
Right.
So it's not externalist. The Hellenistic resources of Islamic philosophy are a fundamental part of Islamic philosophy. So it's not externalist. The Islamic philosophy has incorporated the Hellenistic philosophy and the Hindu philosophy, etc. So it's not absolutely external. There is a part of externalism in that. But the movement of
But it's external from the revelation. It's externalistic apart from the revelation.
yes, it's a part of it.
So it is a part. It is actually not part of the revelation.
It's not part of the revelation,
So in
but
that
it's
sense,
part of the philosophy of Islam.
Right. But
And
it's
all of this, I've outlined it. It's a philosophical text.
okay. I get that. So it's really then it comes down to the question of epistemology,
Yeah.
right? And then my next question then would be: do we have to be mystical in order to engage or to go in this way of post-Islam? In a way, you're inviting us or the Muslim community to embrace the way of the mystics, right? Because you need to somehow attain the truth more directly, right? In a more direct way, and that's really the mystical way. And then it comes back to the critical question that Suleiman was saying. It's not just the content of mystical experience, but I would also argue that even the structure of mystical experience is different for people.
Yes.
It's
Of
contingent
course.
upon
Of course,
my
of
education, my vision of the world. A Hindu would have a different mystical experience, not just in content, but
But
even
there is an
in
invariant.
structure. Really?
There is an invariant that is ineffable. Ineffable.
Yes.
It is clear. Ineffable in French.
Yes.
That it's something that we cannot speak of.
Yes.
And I think that Peirce or William James, I am not sure, make it a central characteristic of mystical experience. We cannot talk about it. Saint Teresa of Avila talks about it in some way. Hallaj talks about it in some way. But the invariant that all of these talks talk about the untalkable.
Yes.
In fact, this is the invariant of all these perspectives. In
Right.
fact.
Perhaps yes. Yes, you're right. But it's difficult to make. It is difficult to create a cohesive movement that would actually, change Islam from within, if you acknowledge that there is really nothing that unites these people cohesively, only this kind of invariant that you're mentioning.
Yes.
There is not enough substance that actually unites them so that the experience will be translatable and communicable to the outside.
That is the central problem of Postislam. I said my final part toward critical horizons, because I've said it's not a closed system. I'm constructing it.
Yes.
No, and that is a problem, because it resonates also to the problem of the eventual part of the mystical experience. I mean, I don't have a mystical experience 24 hours a day.
Yes.
It doesn't have any sense.
Right.
In the same time, there is no revolution every day.
Right.
How to make an eventual, how to converse an event to a prosaic state of affair. That is the central. I mean, that is the real problem.
Yes.
I don't have an answer to this, because it is a work in progress. But this is a central problem, in fact.
Okay. Thank you very much. I mean, we grilled you a little bit, right? With these questions, but you held on. So thank you. We need to move on in our session, so thank you again.